right. So what is TaPoS? The term TaPoS, transactions as proof of stake, means that submitting a transaction contributes to consensus and helps to secure the chain by making forks more difficult. It does this by including a reference to a recent block in every transaction. By doing this, we make it so that every transaction effectively acts as a commitment to stay on the fork that it references. TaPoS requires the signer to identify a fork that the transaction will be applied on and prevents the transaction from being ported to a different fork. This is important for the signer because your willingness to sign a transaction is implicitly dependent on your view of the state of the world at the point that you sign it. Now, obviously, that may include many things that are impossible to enumerate or quantify. We can't ensure that someone's view of the real world is accurate, but we can check his view of the chain. And since transactions are executed on the chain, that's always going to be a significant part of the relevant conditions. So checking it is helpful to ensure that the signer is really signing what he thinks he is. The other effect of TaPoS is to impact forks. Now, forks of a chain happen relatively rarely, but they still do happen. Even if the algorithms governing it are formally correct and theoretically make forks impossible, they don't really prevent it entirely because ultimately consensus isn't technical. It's a matter of agreement between people. Consensus only becomes a matter of technical specifications when people agree on a set of rules to follow. But the social consensus is always prior to the technical consensus and can override the technical consensus at any time. So TaPoS primarily affects the social consensus by making a switch to another fork undesirable or more difficult. There are two main outcomes that you can have from a fork. One is that everyone moves to the new fork and the old fork is completely defunct. This is normal for the microforks that occasionally appear before consensus is reached. Microforks like that are mostly unaffected by TaPoS because when you choose a block to reference for TaPoS, it will typically be a block that is expected to be stable, often one that is supposedly irreversible. For deeper forks, well, we really don't want that to happen. And TaPoS tries to make such deep forks harder because anyone who depends on transactions that are tied to this specific fork will be unwilling to move to a different fork. Of course, it depends on the details of the transaction, but as a general rule, the deeper a fork is, the more people will be upset by it, which makes it less viable. The other kind of a fork is when the community splits. So Alice and Bob follow one fork, Carol and Dave follow a different fork. So TaPoS doesn't really do anything to prevent this kind of fork, but it does make such forks run better because once the split is finalized, you effectively have two independent chains. So since TaPoS references the fork that you are on, it prevents transactions intended for one fork from being replayed on the other. So of course, TaPoS isn't perfect. There are lots of ways to bypass it. If enough people agree, there's no way to prevent them from changing the rules in any way they want, including altering how TaPoS works. But it's a pain to do that. So if you want to modify the chain like that, it's almost always going to be easier to directly alter the chain state, either bypassing the chain rules entirely or going through some sort of privileged service. There are probably other ways as well, but all of these methods have one thing in common that makes them better than a fork. That is, they leave a permanent record in the chain history. So changing the transaction processing rules will show up as a set code. A privileged service has to apply changes through transactions, which will be visible in the history. And loading from a snapshot is the most visible because it just means that the chain history ends. On the other hand, if we just change the head block, once everyone has the new head, it appears as if the original fork never happened and there's no record of it. Basically, we want people to choose the second option here and write a privileged service because it leaves a clear record of what happened and it can be controlled by on-chain governance. Since this is what we want people to do, we want it to be the easiest and simplest option. And TaPoS makes forking more difficult and thus pushes people towards the options that give better results in the long run. So The implementation of TaPoS in Sybase, we identify the reference block by a single octet, which is an index into a table containing 256 block IDs. So the table is split in half. Each half is a circular buffer with 128 elements. One of those buffers is updated every block, which allows precise targeting of TaPoS for transactions with a short timeout, which should account for the majority of transactions. The other buffer is updated every 8,000 blocks. With a 1-second block interval, that allows transactions to have a lifetime up to 12 days, which should be sufficient for most offline signing. This gives us a very compact representation, both in terms of the amount of space it uses in a transaction and the amount of space needed to track the table in the chain state, while still allowing for all the common use cases. Any questions?